Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Today, we're going to talk about the Russian economy, the sanctions against Russia, their effect or their non-effect, as well as what the West and others can do more to support Ukraine. Almost 2.5 years have passed since Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. The humanitarian suffering is, of course, enormous, and there seems to be no quick end to this carnage. The West, led by the European Union, the US, G7, and many other countries, were quick to impose sanctions on Russia, and they have continued. Just recently, the EU issued its 14th sanctions package. The aim of the sanctions, they are economical, they're political, cultural, trade-wise, etc., are, of course, to make a clear political statement that the invasion was unacceptable, in violation of international rules, the global security order, etc. But, of course, even more importantly, to try to isolate Russia's economy and erode the country's possibility to pursue the war. But the war is ongoing, and there are no signs, actually, that Russia's economy is very affected by the sanctions. Some sanctions have obviously been painful for Russia, but the economy is not collapsing, as some optimists predicted in the beginning of the conflict. In fact, Russia's economy grew by 3.6% last year, and parts of the manufacturing industry is actually growing. Unemployment is very low. So how can we explain this? Are sanctions meaningless? How can we explain the resilience of the Russian economy? And what can the world do to more intelligently support Ukraine? These are very difficult questions, but I have two extremely qualified guests with me today to help us to understand and explain this. A warm welcome to Sergei Guriev, until recently Director of Sciences Po in Paris, now Dean at the London Business School, and also Elena Rybakova, who is Director at the International Affairs Program at Kiev School of Economics, a Fellow at Bruegel in Brussels, and also a colleague at Peterson. So you are both very welcome. Thank you for joining despite holiday season. To start with you, Sergei, tell us a little bit of the background of the sanction. Was it ever realistic that they were going to be successful?
Yes, it was actually unprecedented to see how sanctions rolled out very quickly. And just to give you the background, so this war was expected. And so the idea of the Western coalition was to warn Putin not to start this war. If you think about theory of international relations, sanctions are a deterrent, are a threat. And so if the aggressor or perpetrator or violator of international rules actually decides to go ahead, that means this deterrent has failed. But you still need to introduce the sanctions so the future aggressors reconsider. And this is why the West has introduced those dramatic sanctions. Now, Russia is a big world champion in terms of number of sanctions. It has more sanctions introduced against Russia than the whole other sanctioned countries combined. Most important sanctions were the sanctions against sovereign reserves, central bank reserves, where the West frozen on the third day of the war, frozen about $300 billion worth of Russian assets. And then, of course, the West also limited exports of military and dual-purpose equipment to Russia, which was also very important. So these sanctions were important. The other sanctions which played a role were oil sanctions. And unfortunately, oil sanctions were introduced much later. They were announced in the end of May, beginning of June. But they were only effective beginning December 2022. And for the whole 2022, Putin was actually getting a lot of money from exporting oil. So when people say that Putin lost 300 billion, we shouldn't forget that in 2022, trade surplus, since we talk about trade surplus was about $230 billion, simply because the oil sanctions were slow. Then what happened also, which is unprecedented, the Western coalition has created this instrument called oil price cap. So the Western partners decided that it would be very dangerous to remove Russian oil from the global market because it would result in an oil price spike, and Russia would actually be able to benefit from that, selling less oil but selling remaining oil at a much higher price. So what the West did, they said, you can still sell your oil, but not above $60 per barrel for seaborne oil. These sanctions would never apply to pipeline oil that Russia sells to China. So, and this is the answer to your question, what was and was not realistic. This time around, the West has realized that Western coalition only accounts for half of global economy and not 80%, like it would have been several decades ago, which I think is a big achievement if you think about this. The idea of Western development aid was to develop economies which used to be low-income economies. The problem is that emerging markets, many of the non-Western countries, decided not to join sanctions coalition. And that is also a big realization, big surprise for Western countries, that it turns out that they've lost a lot of soft power with the rest of the world. And these countries have not recognized invasion as a lawful invasion. They've not, even before that, they've not recognized annexation of Crimea, but they also didn't join sanctions. And they continue to buy Russian oil and gas, continue to provide Russia with various technologies that Russia is using to kill Ukrainians. But just to answer your question about the impact of the sanctions, we should not compare the impact of the sanctions with our wishful thinking. So we shouldn't say sanctions have no impact because the war is still continuing. Now, we should compare the worlds with and without sanctions. What is the counterfactual scenario if sanctions were not introduced in 2022? And in this world, Putin would have much more money, access to military, easy access, unlimited access to advanced military technology. And in that scenario, of course, the war would probably end by now, but would end not in favor of Ukraine. And I think this is something that we should really remember, that Putin has not won this war, and much of this outcome is explained by the fact that the West was resolute, sometimes slow, sometimes not sufficiently united, but overall these sanctions have made sure that Ukraine has not lost this war. But it was not realistic, if you ask about this, it was not realistic to think that, given that half of the world doesn't support the sanctions, that Putin would have his economy destroyed.
Thank you very much for this. Elena, do you agree, if we look back, knowing what we know now, could we have done it differently? In a more strategic way, these sanctions?
Well, I think Sergei has given a brilliant introduction to this topic, so it's hard to follow on, but I would like to add a few issues. One is what we learned from this experience is that what our colleague at Peterson, Jeff Schott, has been writing about in the past is thinking about the cost to sender. We've had many decades when the larger economies like the United States were sanctioning much smaller and less integrated globally economies of financial markets, whether it's Iran or North Korea or Venezuela. And therefore, the issue of the cost to sender to the large economy that is exercising sanctions never really came up in the political process. So to me, the big takeaway from this episode is to understand, to be open-eyed about the cost to sender. For example, when we started discussing the energy sanctions on Russia, in a way, Russia has self-sanctioned, and therefore Gazprom money or gas prices increased, and Europe sort of had to do without gas. But in terms of oil, we kept on struggling to find the right solution in a timely manner. As Sergei pointed out, in 2022, we didn't do any measures on Russian oil. So Russia enjoyed an extraordinary positive terms of trade shock. And if you compare performance of Russia, exactly, either counterfactual or to other commodities exporters, we've seen commodities exporters experience almost double-digit growth that year, right? So we should be comparing to that, Russia's small contraction or the reported small contraction in 2022. So, but because of us not thinking strategically about this cost to sender, what are the political processes internally, we sort of sleepwalked into a decision of not enforcing the oil sanctions in the right way and introducing them too late. And I think it is okay to have the political discussion to say, look, at this particular moment, politically, it's too costly for us, how we can minimize our costs, but at the same time have an impact on Russia. But we didn't really have that discussion in the open. What we did, we produced this mechanism of the oil price cap, and I have to say I'm not the biggest fan, but here we are. I would have preferred maybe a tax, for example, or an escrow account on Russian oil. But it was the oil price cap, we produced this mechanism, but at the same time, we didn't use all the levers to enforce it. Because even after we agreed and introduced the mechanism, we were too worried that if we enforce it, then we're going to lose Russian oil. So we ended up with this dual objective of having Russian oil in the market and at the same time hurting Russian revenues. And when these two objectives came into conflict, the first one won for political reasons of this cost of sender issue. So I think this is one important takeaway for me. The second important takeaway for me is that US and many other countries have realized that they have leverage in certain aspects, like, you know, our friends Henry Farrell wrote about weaponized interdependence, right? They have leverage in financial systems, but they don't necessarily have leverage in many other systems or networks, be it the oil market or this complicated chips and other types of inputs, dual-use inputs into Russian military. So our ability to squeeze out those networks is much more limited because we're not always controlling the critical nodes. And even when we are controlling the critical nodes, we don't yet have the administrative infrastructure to be able to implement those sanctions or export controls the way that we can do with the financial sector sanctions. So that's what I would add to Sergei's. But whether it was realistic to expect Russia to disintegrate from sanctions or to have a regime change with sanctions, well, no. You know, it's not like a magic wand, you do it and then regime disappears and war ends. Sanctions have to work with many other components. It is a military aid to Ukraine. It is our strategic sort of interaction with Russia, with Europe, with Ukraine. So it's part of this broader economic statecraft. It's part of the sort of multidisciplinary approach. It can do something. It can throw sand in the wheels of Russian war machinery. It can provide an opening for Ukraine to maybe make advances in terms of liberating territories until Russia finds the workarounds. But sanctions by itself are not an answer to the war.
And there, apart from the mistakes or the sort of weaknesses when it comes to the energy sanctions, there are lots of loopholes as well. I mean, every day we read about European and Western companies who get different kinds of exceptions from the sanctions regime. And then, of course, we have big neighbors such as India and China, who has been increasing their, especially in energy sector, their trade with Russia as well. How important has that been? Whoever, Sergei?
Yeah, this is important, obviously, and Elena has actually done a lot of work pinning down individual companies which help Putin continue this war, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. But this is very important, and this is a cat and mouse game or a whack-a-mole game, if you like. Putin always tries to find a new loophole to import those chips that Elena was talking about through third countries. What the Western coalition does, and this is what they've learned to do very well by now, is to threaten the third countries with secondary sanctions. And you know much better than anybody else around this table that Europe did not like this instrument of secondary sanctions ever. But after 2022, Europe learned how to use it. And Europe joined United States in talking to Chinese, Turkish, Emirati, Kazakh banks who say, look, if you want to conduct business in Russia, you have to bear in mind that once you touch somebody who helps Putin's war, we will impose sanctions on you. And that's been extremely effective, but that only started in the last half a year after executive order of President Biden. Now, another thing is shadow tanker fleet. This is very important. Elena mentioned the workarounds of sanctions. So before Putin learned how to overcome the oil sanctions, he's lost a lot of money. You asked us how costly sanctions are. So there is an estimate by the Atlantic Council. For the first 10 months of 2023, Putin lost about $50 billion. Now, $50 billion is just 3% of Putin's GDP. So You may say it's too much, it's too little, but it's actually quite significant. And for example, I'll give you an example. Right now, Putin's remaining liquid part of sovereign wealth fund is also $50 billion in yuan and gold. So if not for Putin being able to circumvent those sanctions with a shadow tanker fleet, he would maybe by now he would have had zero in the sovereign wealth fund. And so by now, again, Europe and US are trying to whack this mole as well to actually sanction individual vessels. So there is a lot of evolution in thinking how you design sanctions and how you enforce sanctions, more importantly, and I think it's very, very important. And also Europe and US identifying individuals, identifying individual entities, and most importantly individual banks that help Putin, and sanction them. And so every package of sanctions has a list of entities that try to help Putin, and these people, some of them now regret that. And so the next generation of Putin's enablers ask Putin for more and more money. And this is the idea of this cat and mouse game. When you close this loophole, the next loophole will be more expensive by definition. The less money Putin has, the less money he has to recruit soldiers in Russian regions and to buy Western technology, Iranian drones, North Korean artillery munitions, and so on. So I think effort and vigilance are saving Ukrainian lives and Ukrainian cities.
So it's a bit like learning by doing, because as you both said, this is the biggest sanction regime ever in history. It's not comparable even to the anti-apartheid sanctions, because the global world economy is so much more integrated today than at that time. But Russia, strangely enough, Russia has been able to use this situation to totally switch to war economy. And that has positive effect, at least on short-term basis, on unemployment and production and so on. So Elina, how is the Russian economy doing today, actually? And how much of that can be explained by this swift to the war economy?
Well, Russian militarized economy is overheating. Russian economy is overheating, period, because they're trying to expand their spending on the military production at such a fast pace that the economy cannot cope. That's why we have the issues with labor shortages. That's why we have very high increases, particularly for the military enterprises and the salaries. And that's why we have relatively high inflation, the reported inflation between 7 and 8. We have interest rates over in high double digits, 16%. Even then, it's still not cooling off the economy. Some people say that you remove certain items, if you focus on just on the CPI that the common person sees, it is more in the 20s rather than 7-8%, because they're trying to gun the economy much more than its capacity. And again, as Sergei was pointing out, because of sanctions and limitations in their economy, they're forced to go outside. They have to go. Putin going to North Korea, if you would have said to Putin himself, probably 10, 15 years ago, he would have laughed at the proposition, right? That their best friends will be Iran and North Korea. Russia was very sort of snobbish about it. It's seen itself as European, part of the G7 plus, G8, right? Now he's supposed to go and beg to North Korea and drive around Mercedes or whatever he was driving there in order to be able to get extra shells and potentially extra people. What I'm suspecting, some of the deals that are being made there is ways to find people to come to Russia and work in the military enterprises, some of them very toxic, actually, military enterprises, or maybe trying to have investments in North Korea to produce more there, just because domestically the economy is not coping with all the pressure they're putting on. That said, we have sort of a morbid social lift appearing in the Rust Belt. And I think recently FT wrote a very nice article and they interviewed people and they say, look, yes, the war is sad, people are dying, my uncle is dead, but look, I'm getting a higher salary. So people are faced with this absolutely morbid situation where they have relatives dying. There is a war in the colonial war that their country is waging on the neighbor, but at the same time, they're feeling a little bit better. They're feeling better in a way that they haven't felt ever under Putin's regime. because we might talk maybe later about the appointment of Belousov as the Minister of Defense, but he's also one of the persons involved in this endless 5-year plans and private-public partnerships and the national projects, all these efforts to try to bring better opportunities to the region, to diversify Russian economy from this just one-trick pony, oil and other commodities, and they could never succeed. It's been almost 30 years and they're not succeeding. And with the military spending and the draft, which they sort of mobilization or ongoing mobilization, they've managed to give some of the money to these people, again, for the prices, life, human lives, Russian human lives, Ukrainian human lives. But this is how they are sort of supporting this sort of Rust Belt revival in Russia.
But how long can this last?
Well, I think we economists can say it's endogenous, right? It lasts as long as we allow it to last. As Sergei pointed out, we've already squeezed a lot of resources from Russia. Just the effect of the sanctions, it is, at the peak, it was more than 100 billion of lost revenues. I think now it's more than 70 billion of lost revenues. At the same time, we have seen colleagues, Craig Kennedy from Harvard, estimate that the shadow fleet cost more than $8.5 billion. We also estimate that Russia now has more than 400 vessels, which they had to go and buy. And these are poor quality vessels. These are the what is it called? These are the rusty sort of end of life vessels, which they will have to keep on replacing. By the way, if OFAC were to continue to sanction vessels, that would also keep Russia off guard, because if you trying to buy a vessel, first of all, the market is already limited, the secondary market, and to construct a new vessel, to produce a new vessel takes time. So we can actually squeeze out Russia from the shadow fleet market, and we definitely can make it much more expensive. So if we intensify our efforts there to reduce the revenues, and on the other hand, to make access to the special components even more challenging and more expensive, and it's already in a way happening because Putin has to go to North Korea and beg for more missiles, right? So we can keep on squeezing. And I think the process is endogenous. It will last as long as we are, in a way, allowing it to last.
So a more coherent upgrading of the sanctions regime and the better coordination between the EU, US, G7 and other allies. Do you see this happening, Sergei?
I think Putin is fighting this war because he's waiting for the election in the US. He thinks that Western
There's
unity
election in the US.
maybe fractured in already in November, but maybe in January. And so this is his bet right now. Talking about how long it's going to last, I would just mention that Putin announced a significant increase in taxes, something that he's not done before. That shows that he already understands that budget constraint is binding. So he wants to raise taxes by about 1.5% of GDP, which is not nothing for economic performance as well. Also, when people say that Russian economy is doing well, this is not exactly what, for example, the Russian central bank is saying, right? Russian central bank says economy is overheated. And whenever we look at numbers, GDP numbers, we should remember that all GDP growth is driven by military economy that you mentioned, Cecilia. So there is a report, there is a CPI report, there is a Buffett report on the Russian economy on the war footing, which shows that industries that are connected to the war are growing, other industries are not. And when you think about this, yes, if you produce a new tank and the tank is burned in Ukraine, that sounds like value added, right? You count the value of the tank as contribution to GDP, but it's equivalent to just injecting cash into this economy without anything produced. And of course, it's highly inflationary. The same goes into what Elena has mentioned about paying salaries to soldiers who go in Ukraine, don't produce anything, get killed, then you just print cash and give it to soldiers. So this is also very inflationary, and central banks very unhappy about this, and they will raise interest rates. Interest rates in Russia now are higher than interest rates in Ukraine. There is potential mismeasurement of inflation, and I can go into this. there are many indicators that inflation is underestimated because there is no adjustment for quality. Basically, you buy Chinese cars at the price of German cars. And for Russian Statistical Agency, this is one car and the same price, no inflation. But this Chinese car used to be priced at half of what is being sold right now. And so if you adjust for quality, you arrive at a much higher inflation. That would bring down the real economic performance if you calculate that correctly. But we don't have a systematic estimation of that. I mentioned in cars because with the cars, there is an estimation that prices actually doubled for the same comparable cars. And there is a substitution between German and Chinese cars. Previously, that was average car was a Western car assembled in Russia. Now, average car is a Chinese car. So it's a new world. Statistics are not very reliable. There are some reliable statistics. You mentioned unemployment. Unemployment is at a historical low. Yep. It's below 3%, but there is also nothing to celebrate because it shows the shortage of labor, that shows overheating, that shows Russian companies face very high wages, which is good news for employees, but not good news for business. Russia tries to import labor and goes as far as to Kenya and as far as to North Korea. And it's hard because a lot of Russians have left. A lot of Russians are in Ukraine. A lot of Russians were killed in Ukraine or wounded in Ukraine. So we are talking about a couple of percentages of workforce, of labor force that have been taken out of labor force. And every month, Putin recruits another 30,000 Russians, taking them out of productive economy. So economic statistics are not actually lying, but they are giving you a misleading impression of how well Russian economy is doing. So I would not overestimate that.
But at some point, it reaches a point of no return, of course, when there are no more people and when the inflation really gets overheated. But obviously hard to predict, and also the lack of data, as you said. Yes, Elena.
Cecilia, you actually and Sergei were making a very important point. When people say about the war attrition between these two countries, saying, look, Russia is so huge, has so many people, look, Ukraine is much smaller, but we need to think about the demographics, right? So the actual group that potentially is mobilizable of males is actually relatively small. We've seen colleagues estimate about maybe 20 million. You can look at the sort of the violin charts for Russia, right? Then you look inside there are some people who cannot possibly serve, people who already are out of the labor market and out of the military market. There are deaths which are severely, obviously not reported in Russia. There are many people who actually left. And again, they're not showing up in the Russian statistics. We estimated before that maybe up to 1 million people left. Recently, I think the Bell did a study where they have more closer to between 600,000 and 700,000 people left and never came back. The Russian statistics doesn't allow for good accountability of the sort of net outflow of people. But if you look at the registrations in Europe, in the US, and Turkey of people applying for permanent residency, then from that you can back out who has left and who is not coming back to Russia. And I think that's also why there are two things, sort of indirect indicators are showing. One is mobilization. Putin is afraid of doing mobilization, not just because it's politically unpopular, also because it's going to destroy his labor market completely. Because if he tries to mobilize, more people are going to try to leave or going to go into hiding. So he's not going to mobilize as much as he needs, but he's also going to damage severely the labor market. And he's probably afraid of that already. So I think that is a very good indicator. The other indicator is this contractual sort of payments for people to come and serve. I think they've increased almost 5 times. It also tells you that people are just not willing to go. You have to keep on increasing that price for people to come and die in Ukraine. So that again is an indicator of just how tight this labor market is and how much they're struggling. And then finally, as Sergei pointed out, there have been leaks from the Russian production facilities, drone production facilities. The press has written about it. Alabuga, for example, where they actually have supposedly in this leaked documents that the press has, I think the FT wrote about it, they actually call people like Tajiks, that's not humans, right? You sort of Tajiks, we're going to try to import them. And then there is another tight line, which I'm not even sure, how to interpret that, Mulatki, so sort of like some people from sort of a very very derogatory term actually in Russian about people from Africa to come and work in the highly toxic enterprises in Russia that is the drone production. So the labor market is already very tight.
Interesting. There are lots of questions coming up on this, so maybe we should take some. You partly answered, but you mentioned our colleague Jeff Schott, who has also done studies in this. He asks, Putin changed strategies from initial blitzkrieg to war of attrition, betting that Western sanctions would not sustain long enough to save Ukraine. Can the Russian economy outlast the willingness of the West to sustain sanctions and continue financial military assistance to Ukraine? Will you partly answer that as well? How long can it sustain? Anything more you want to add on that?
I would say that I agree with Elina. If the West is not sufficiently resolute, united, and resilient, then Putin can outlast the West. Right now, Putin is waiting for U.S. elections. But overall, if you look at relative size of Western economy and Russian economy, of course, Western economy in the long run can outgun Russian economy. But for that, the West needs unity. The West needs to rearm, including Europe. Europe is still to deliver the number of artillery shells that it's promised to Ukraine. So this is a war where quantity matters. And in that sense, of course, eventually the West can outproduce Russia, outgun Russia. But that depends on unity of the West. And so far, the West has been united, but it also underinvested in rearmament. So the West has not built capacity, and this is actually very understandable. If you build defense industry now, then the war in Ukraine stops. What do you do with this industry? You disarm again, right? So it's a threat. It's a credible threat. It's a deterrent, and nobody wants to invest in wasteful deterrents. So this is a very, very hard set of decisions, and that's why Putin is trying to outlast the West. The other factor, which is very, very important, is Ukrainians themselves. So it's very hard to find soldiers, not just in Russia, but also in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, the country is also suffering from demographic challenges. And so this is one source of the worry. And Putin is counting on this as well. But eventually, it's a hot war. And I think the issue is not about Putin's economy sustaining itself. The issue is whether Ukraine gets enough weapons to gain territory. And my understanding is that military experts are now discovering a lot of surprises in how this war is fought with all the drones on both sides. They kind of come to a consensus that it's almost impossible to move the front line either way. With the minefields and drones, it's very hard to advance by Russian troops or Ukrainian troops. But there is actually another prize, another thing which is at stake, which is Crimea. So with long-range missiles, Ukraine, if it has enough long-range missiles, Ukraine can do a lot and get Crimea back. And the other thing is, of course, air defense. If Ukraine is to start rebuilding, it needs to cover all its territory with air defense. There is a major improvement now with fighter jets, F-16s, which are coming, and that will help, and Patriots as well. It's not enough yet, but again, a lot has changed in the last few months. So there is optimism on the side of Ukraine sustaining at least some territory and maybe gaining some territory. But at this moment, as long as Putin is in power, being honest, I don't see how Putin doesn't have enough resources to continue this war at some intensity and therefore keeping some territory. No Ukrainian president will ever sign a peace treaty losing the territory, but there could be a truce, there could be a ceasefire like between North and South Korea, just to wait until the regime change in the Kremlin. And when that happens, it is not impossible that Russia will give back the territory.
But the cause of this has, as you both mentioned, been, of course, the unity of the West, mainly US and EU, but also a whole range of other allies. And we see now how countries are stepping up, both the economic support, the discussions on how to use the frozen assets, which has been very complicated. We'll come back to that in a moment. The EU just launched negotiations of membership. This is, of course, a long term, but it's an important symbolic date to start negotiations. But the EU is this week will hopefully confirm the new president, or the old president of the commission. There will be a new commission in a couple of months. There is an election in the US, and this unity is fragile, of course. And even if we have seen that there is still a very strong support for Ukraine among the citizens and among the main parties all across, it is fragile. NATO just had its summit last week, where NATO in itself promised continued support, and then countries within NATO have made extra promises as well. But if there is a change in the White House, we know that both the possible incoming President Trump and his new vice president are very skeptical. They have promised to end the war in 24 hours. And also we see popping up skeptical parties in the European Union as well. So this is, of course, a very fragile coalition. What needs to be done the coming month in order to make sure that maximum pressure is put on Russia and maximum support is given to Ukraine on the whole range of area, economic, political, military, etc.?
Well, I think Sergei pointed out the most important one is military support, delivering military support in time. Because at the moment, from what we understand from military experts, it's not about the lack of people or lack of the sort of protective defenses in Ukraine. It's about ability to plan. So if you're not getting the weapons in time, then it also means that you cannot possibly plan which flank you're protecting and where you're moving forward. It is also very difficult to leverage power. Ukrainian troops have power. You have highly skilled people still in the front lines. Some of them step back and already training new troops. Yes, it is very difficult to continue with mobilization, but this is also the army that has been already preparing for many years and has been an active defense now for a number of years. So there is a lot of new experience in terms of production, in terms of the way of deploying this new weaponry, the different kinds of weaponry development. You know, almost every other person is working on a drone at home in the nighttime when they're sort of trying to do their day job during the day. So it's about leveraging, allowing Ukrainian army to leverage their power, maybe for the moment to defend themselves successfully, and maybe in the future again to sort of taking back some of their territory. So I think these are the critical issues. Now going forward, and there is a question, I'm sure, about the US elections, I think the ball is squarely in European court. The Europeans need to decide where they stand and continue sort of maintaining that coalition. And I think for that is very important to be, again, transparent about how we discuss our objectives. If there are some people who've been recently writing letters, and we can talk more about supposed peace in Ukraine and how they feel sympathy for Ukrainian people dying, what is really important is to unpick that argument. And the bottom line of that argument, when you really drill it down, and we have seen that actually in Madrid, when one of the advisors to Orban was talking, it was a public event. In the end of the day, the argument boils down to one simple thing: we don't care. You know, Ukraine is on its own. We're part of the bigger bloc. Putin is unlikely to come for us. Hungary, for example, although Hungary might remember the 60s and the Soviet Union, right? But we're already part of the bigger bloc. So, you know, we really don't care about Ukraine. We want to spend our money at home. We think that if we give Ukraine to Putin, he's not going to come for us. It is an open discussion. For example, I personally believe that this is a creepy crawly expansion. In 2014 and 2008, we missed the signals from the regime that they're getting more appetite. And of course, with more eating, they got more appetite and they move forward. I do worry about economic and actual physical security in Europe if we let Ukraine fail, right? So for me, the debate is very simple. We need to support Ukraine in order for Putin not to advance further on European territory. And that's why it's in the end of the day up to Europeans to protect themselves, even if we'll lose some of the cohesion, unfortunately, with potentially Trump's administration. If you look at the size of GDP of Europe versus Russia, it pales in comparison. Russia is barely the size, I think, of Spain, or one of the smaller countries in Europe. So we can't just compare Ukraine and Russia. We have to compare Europe versus Russia. the ability of European defense industry to be innovative, to produce more, to cooperate with your Ukrainian defense industry versus Russia. Again, it is definitely has a clear advantage. And even the cost of spending now of supporting Ukraine is not even 1% of European GDP. In Russia, military spending is at least 6, 7, or potentially more percent of Russia's GDP, and the economy is already overheating. So yes, we have a chance, but we need to understand that what are we protecting here? Are we protecting here European sovereignty and security or not?
But the Western coalition is actually broader than just the US and Europe. You have UK, Norway, obviously. You have Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Mexico, not Mexico, Canada. So it is broader. Can there be a more coherent, broader global alliance of support if the US would withdraw or stop at all supporting by the end of the year? What do you think, Sergei?
Well, we see already a lot of coordination. You know, you've seen, for example, South Korea, which is debating providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. Why? Because Russia is teaming up with North Korea and potentially providing a transfer of technologies for North Korean nuclear. This is something that South Korea cannot possibly stand for, right? And they might consider changing their policy. We already see some caution from Japan. For example, when we wrote some of the first analysis of the companies' sort of supply networks to Russia, of Western companies' supply networks to Russia, some of actually Japanese authorities and banks came to us first. They actually were very concerned about it. So we do see, I think, broader coalition for sure that can be leveraged. And we already see a lot of leverage for sanctions coordination in this broader coalition. If you look at the countries that have imposed export controls on Russia, these are more than 50 countries. So it is not just, you know, Europe and the US, as you correctly point out.
How do you see this, Sergei? And what role could these? There's been a lot of frozen assets from Russia. Most of them are in Europe. Some of them are spread all over the world, and has been a very long and painful, and I think to many people a bit inexplicable. Why is it so hard to use that money? I mean, Russia has invaded a sovereign country against international law. Now that money is frozen. How come we can't use it in a more strategic way? There are lots of legal issues, obviously, but can that money also be used to support Ukraine militarily, or is it more for reconstruction?
There is a legal question, and I'm not a legal expert, but legal experts are just saying there is no legal basis for expropriating those assets. And you can freeze, but for expropriation, you actually need a court decision. And we don't know which court to go
or
to.
The interests.
In principle, you can, but even that, if you think about this, is also not obvious. But and there is a debate about this as well. Now, it will be used. I think the revenue will be used. There'll be also securities issued against those assets as a collateral, assuming that in the future, there will be a judicial decision to confiscate those assets, and the market will price the probability of this decision. So if I issue you a bond against $1 billion of Russian assets, and you only pay 80% of the face value of this bond, that means that you evaluate the probability of successful confiscation by about 80%. So there is a debate about this. It is very important to take these assets and give them to Ukraine. We saw, and Elena was talking about this, how certain members of the Western coalitions would say, we don't care about Ukraine. We need this money. We have people who are left behind who need this money at home. And if Russia can be forced to pay for what Russia has done to Ukraine, it's better than we, American or European taxpayers, have to pay. And that is a completely understandable argument. But my understanding is that there is no consensus in the legal profession, then that is doable. So this is a debate, and I think, and I actually wrote about this together with other CPR colleagues, especially Yuri Gorodnichenko and several chief economists of the International Monetary Fund. We wrote the first report on reconstruction of Ukraine already in the beginning of April 2022. And we said that this is the biggest pot of money that needs to be used for reconstruction of Ukraine. But to get to the reconstruction, if you can confiscate it now and use it for budget support of Ukraine today, even better.
I think the G7 agreed to provide $50 billion in loans to Ukraine, and they would be sort of covered by the proceeds of frozen assets as a start. But there are still, of course, a lot of legal hiccups here, both within the European Union and then between the EU and the US and others discussing that. But it's a considerable amount of money that's there. Sorry,
since you mentioned G7, first President Biden and G7 leaders together issued a statement which says President Putin will not see this money back before he pays for compensation, reparation, reconstruction of Ukraine. And this is the pathway, if you think about this. So maybe Ukraine will not get this money right away, but Ukraine will sue Putin somewhere. He will say no to Ukraine, saying, I'm not going to pay for all the destruction I've caused. And then Ukraine will get this money after this legal decision. And before that happens, Putin will not be able to get this money back.
And just to follow up exactly on that important G7 statement, I think the next step now for the EU is to pass the necessary legislation. We haven't seen that yet. Of course, for obvious reasons, there's political process happening in the EU, but we need to see that soon, because that is obligation of the EU under this G7 statement to make the necessary changes, to put it to the vote, so then they can proceed with taking over this proceeds. And just to add very quickly on the legal, and I'll leave it here for the legal experts to debate, with none of us are here. Of course, in the UN, you do have a concept of countermeasures. You know, in the Charter, I think the lawyers had been trying to get rid of it, but eventually realized that no, we can't. We live in the world that we live in. We will never have a UN resolution, because Russia is not going to have a resolution against itself. So under the concept of countermeasures, there are lawyers who are discussing that it is possible legally to take this money. Of course, in the EU is a debate, and of course, like on many issues, lawyers do not agree until they eventually leads to a political consensus and maybe potentially legal changes. We have seen the Repo Act in the US as well. And in the end of the day, it's important that Russia pays. We find the legal mechanism to be able to have Russia pay. In terms of the proceeds, unless there is a secret side agreement with Euroclear, which I think by now we decided there isn't such an agreement, the proceeds do not belong to Russia, because normally you would never have money left over as a deposit on this account. So, and then there is an issue of with Euroclear.
So we just need the political decision to use that, which complicates, because there's no new commission in place, and the current president of the European Union now is chaired by Hungary, who has not been very willing to move on these issues. In the audience, people who are watching us today, there are lots of questions on the sanctions and how they can be enforced. There's one question of if there is an evaluation of the sanctions on Russia and the effects of the US economy, if that has been done, if there is something we can, if that could impact the US resolve to keep the sanction. And then also if there is a way to enforce further from our side, the embargo on traders going via China, Turkey, and other weak points around Russia, if more can be done there. So there's two questions, but they're quite similar. Starting with the US, is there any evaluation of if the US economy has been affected by the sanctions?
We haven't. We have seen very little research on that. We've seen research by colleagues in Europe on European effects. And as you remember, we've had wonderful debates, and I think Sergei also wrote about it, about we economists, we don't like when there is a kink, right? If there is no substitution, then we get very unhappy. But it's actually turned out there is substitution. It's happening much faster than anybody thought. So we also need to remember the extraordinary resilience of European economy. We tend to always put it down. And if I talk even to sort of common friends who are not economists, they say, well, but Europe is struggling. The gas prices are so high. It's like, when was the last time you checked the numbers? You know, but there is a lot of the narrative that people forget that, first of all, the gas prices are back to where they were before the war. The gas prices increased before the invasion even started, because Russia started playing with that even before. Remember, was the feeling of the storage in Europe, right? And then also the incredible resilience. We were predicting almost the rolling blackouts in Europe, and none of that happened, right? So Europe managed to retool itself and refocus relatively quickly. Of course, the medium-term competitors, we need to keep on discussing, but I think that is exceptionally important. For the US, to be honest, I have seen very little. but mostly because still the cost hasn't been that high. Yes, Russia is very integrated into the global commodities market, but US is a commodity producer. US is an oil producer. Maybe it cannot export as much as it cannot really export at the moment much, but it is an energy net producer at this stage. So direct hit for the US has been very limited. There's been some discussion about the spike in commodity prices, which came at the same time when we had globally high inflation and also high inflation in the US. So I think maybe there is a little bit of the sort of issue there, the stickiness of this sort of temporary commodity shock. And we've seen Olivier Blanchard, our colleagues, and Bernanke have written about that, of sort of trying to disentangle what is a more lasting shock to inflation versus the short-term sort of commodities supply shock on the inflation and potentially on the US economy. And of course, we have Jeff Schott in the audience. He cannot comment, but I'm sure he will be following up with more writing on the cost of sender that he has published a book and many papers on.
Sergei,
just to add on this, indeed, these papers of European and especially German economists have shown that the cost will be reasonably low. They use state-of-the-art modeling. Chancellor Scholz at the time said we shouldn't believe in mathematical models. I talked to big businesses, and they are telling me that we cannot stop buying Russian gas. And economists turned out to be right. There was an impact. This impact was in line with their predictions. So Germany did have an economic shock. This shock was manageable. But by the end of the first year of this full-scale invasion, by the end of 2022, Germany stopped using Russian oil, Russian gas, and Russian coal and continued to function. And I think the reason why we don't know anything about impact on the US is because impact on the US was about zero. And so no researcher wanted to work on this because it was obvious that US would not suffer at all. And I would remind you that we talked about oil sanctions delayed until the end of 2022. Actually, US and UK, which were very minor buyers of Russian oil, introduced embargo already in the spring of 2022. So it was no debate on the impact on the US economy. On the third countries, I would just say banks. So when you sanction a company which is a fly-by-night firm which helps to circumvent sanctions, Putin will open a new one. Opening a bank if the bank is sanctioned by the US and Europe is harder. And if there is a bank which is a target of secondary sanctions of the US or Europe or both, that's the end of this bank. So Chinese banks are extremely cautious. And now there is a debate about smaller Chinese banks that don't care about dollars, right? So there are Chinese banks which are not international, and in principle, they can execute trades in yuan. But this is the next step, and US administration is already talking about this. Okay, you have the Chinese small bank, we will sanction this bank, and then we will tell every large Chinese bank that if you touch this small bank, we will sanction you as well. And so this is, again, as Cecilia said, learning by doing. Things we've never thought we would be doing, but it takes effort, it takes ingenuity, but eventually banks are weak points. If the question was about weak points, this is how the sanctions should work. And we've seen in the last few months that Chinese, Turkish, and other banks have become extremely cautious doing business with Russia.
And I would add to that, I absolutely agree with Sergei. We need to use the tool which we can. We have a hammer, let's hammer, right? Not everything is going to be a nail, but we need to use it. And I think it's a very creative way of using banks to help enforce export controls, and it's very effective, as Sergei has explained. We shouldn't be afraid of actually sanction, because we've seen a lot of trade delegations and sanctions delegations going and signaling, and Yellen went, and Wally and others. But I think also if we see evidence of circumvention, we should also actually go for medium-sized banks as well. The second very important measure is also actually going after the corporates. Just like we had the situation with anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing with banks. Remember, 20 years ago, when you came to a bank and asked, oh, but what is your correspondent bank in UAE doing? They would say, I have no idea. It's a netting account. The correspondent sort of thinks, I have no idea how to disentangle it. It's impossible. Money is fungible. Now we know which even flights we flew on in our personal statements, right? So some things we can do. So we need to do something similar with our corporates. And what I find particularly disingenuous when our largest tech companies say, but it's impossible, it's honest reporting. When you have a handful of researchers and investigative journalists can track their distribution networks, and somehow the largest, most complex AI chip producers can't, that to me is suggesting potential willfulness. So I think here you've seen statements of Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, they're getting much more serious about what they call corporate enforcement. Corporate enforcement is polite speak for heads on the pike. And I think we do need to sort of communicate very strongly, and the chair of the Department of Commerce already did that to companies. But the next step to prepare a few very solid files to some of these companies, also call them to Congress. We have seen some hearings already. I testified in one of them. There have been others. Call them to Congress, force them to testify. And this way to send a very strong, tangible signal that we're serious in terms of enforcement of our own corporate compliance with export controls.
You have been giving a lot of sort of recommendations, and based on the 2.5 years almost experience that we have, both when it comes to sanctions and the enforcement and the impact of Russian economy, and then of course we have the support for Ukraine, and they're very entangled. It's hard to push them apart. And if we, for just a moment, disregard the fact that there is political turbulence in Europe and there is an election in the US, we don't really know the outcome of that yet. But if you were to be the sort of chief advisors for G7 the coming year, and give them a to-do list to how in the most strategic, pinpointing way of addressing the Russian economy, improving on the sanctions model, but also supporting Ukraine. This is a huge question. I realize this, but you've been given so many points to do. Can you summarize that before we wind up? Why don't you start, Sergei?
Yes, for me the list is very clear. So the list is enforcing Russian sanctions sanctions on oil through sanctioning shadow tanker fleet and enforcing oil price cap. If that works, also lowering price cap from 60 to say 55 or 50, slowly but surely, leaving Putin with even less money. Enforcing technological sanctions, export controls through secondary sanctions against enabling banks, but also sanctioning every single individual who is trying to help Putin avoiding those sanctions. Work on the confiscation of the assets, and providing weapons to Ukraine. And again, I'm not a military expert, but military experts talk about specific weapons. So I think this list is very important. So with that, I think Putin will have less money. So as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, he will continue this war. But if he has less money, Ukrainian lives will be saved. More Ukrainian lives will be saved.
You, Elena, would you add to that list? I know that you're doing work now on export control and reinforcing that as well, more specifically.
Well, I think, Sergei exactly pointed out the right things. Shadow fleet, sanctioning shadow fleet, stronger attestation process, and this will reduce revenues to Putin, or at least make it very costly for him to circumvent oil sanctions. That means human life saved. Our own corporates, I do want to see a few multi-billion cases in terms of companies' circumvention of sanctions. And companies often say, oh, it's not within legal remit. No, it is. You need to go to the PIIE's documents and read them a bit more carefully. There are also different degrees of knowing. It's at this stage, no company can say we didn't know, because there's been such an abundance of investigation that they could have perfectly gone and asked these researchers for the data. So we are already at the stage they should have known. The question is whether it's willful or not. So I think we need to be very, very sort of strict there. The third way is, and Cecilia, you know most about it, is talking to the countries not directly sort of the fence sitters, or countries who do not see this colonial war as their sort of war that they need to think about. Having negotiations with them, whether it's Turkey, UAE, China, having it is, or Malaysia, Philippines, where some of the chips are getting produced, saying that, look, we absolutely want you to stop sending this, or else. In other cases, you know, maybe it's something is less important for me. Whether if there is a shipment of Mercedes parts going through Kazakhstan, well, in the end of the day, I would prioritize shipment of ships for drones or missiles that are hitting children's hospitals versus some cars to some luxury goods or Louis Vuitton bag. You know, so I think we also need to be pragmatic when we talk to the third countries, explaining what is most critical for us, and also putting our whole trade and financial relationship with them at stake. So being also creative in terms of they're not just tit for tat, we're going to do this, but actually, no, we're going to remove your preferential access, for example, to our markets, or we're not going to open certain goods for you. So our whole economic might has to come into the negotiations. And then, of course, most importantly, we should continue to provide military support to Ukraine, and we should be very wary of these so-called peacemakers, some of them who are even convicted of taking Russian money in the past. We should be very understanding that Russian propaganda has been working for many years. This is something that actually they're good at. We need to understand that billions of dollars are being spent on that. And a few $1 million that we spend is just not doing on the fact checking, you know, it's not as popular. Russian propaganda has started working already for decades. It is very sophisticated. It sometimes even includes supposedly pro-Ukrainian think tanks or international experts that sign the letters. You know, it's a very multifaceted and complex propaganda. It's not an old-fashioned sort of Soviet poster about evil NATO. I think we need to be very conscious about that and understand what are the underlying arguments of some of these people that put forward the supposed peace agreements for Ukraine.
We could go on for hours talking about this, but we're getting to the hour. I have learned a lot. Thank you so much, Sergei Guriev and Elena Rybakova, for helping us to sort of sort out what is actually happening and what could be done and what have we learned and the way forward as well. And thank you, all of you who've been listening. This, you can watch it afterwards on the Peterson website if you want to go back to the arguments. I saw there was a question in the audience about this. So thank you so much for joining us, and wishing you a very nice summer. I know some of you are on holiday as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.